Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rudy Hernandez, and I'm a psychology instructor at the Northwest campus of El Paso Community College. I teach psychology, including the classes involving Introduction to Psychology, Human Sexuality, Social Psychology, and Psychology of Adjustment, as well as Personality. In that regard, I wanted to do a presentation that worked with regards to the behavioral aspects of students and their study habits. The topic of my subject is availability of PowerPoint presentations before, during, and after class. In other words, since they have access to the PowerPoint presentation throughout the entire semester, does this help their learning experience or does it hurt their learning experience? And that's what I wanted to find out from a behavioral point of view. In the past, there have been studies with regards to PowerPoint presentations, but the studies have all focused on the best style or the best form of PowerPoint presentations. There has been literally no studies that have been done with regards to the behavioral aspects of it. My study then increases the studies the availability of the PowerPoint presentation, and if they have it available to them, does this affect content retention? Are they better students? Does it affect attendance in class? And finally, does it affect note-taking in class? My question is, will they continue to be attentive because they've had the PowerPoint presentation before, or will they be less attentive and fall asleep because they know that they have the notes on Blackboard and on PowerPoint? And do they really then need to come to class and take notes? The methods of my experiment was that I wanted to find out if having access to the PowerPoint presentation before, during, and after class increased or had an effect on content retention, attendance, and note-taking. Both groups were exposed to the same material, the material related to sensory and perception and developmental psychology. Both groups were told that they should read the relevant chapters. They were exposed to the face-to-face lecture and a PowerPoint presentation in the material of class. The dependent variables, in other words, what we were measuring, were test 1 before the experiment with both the control group and the experimental group, test 2 taken after the experiment, again with the control group and with the experimental group. The independent variable, the manipulation that we were conducting in the experiment, had to do with whether the experimental group had an effect in terms of content, note-taking, and attendance, because they had access to the PowerPoint presentation before, during class, and after class, whereas the control group was only provided the PowerPoint presentation during class. So my initial assumption was that they would need to pay more attention then, and perhaps the students who had access to it throughout the entire time were not as attentive. The subjects were 2 different Introduction to Psychology classes, composed of both male and female students. There was no significant difference in terms of gender, so there were no gender bias. The ages ranged from 18 to 45, male and female, and again, there were no significant difference in terms of age, so there was no age difference as well. After I conducted the experiment, I did the experiment in September. I gave them both groups exam 1. I noted their test results. I also noted the attendance, and I also noted note-taking prior to the experiment. The entire month of February is when I conducted the experiment, and the first week in March, about the 5th of March, so it was like 5 weeks that there was a time period there, I gave them exam 2, and I checked the scores on exam 1 from the control group who was not exposed to the PowerPoint presentation and the experimental group that was exposed to the PowerPoint presentation. On exam 1, the control group scored a mean score of 82, with a high score of 98 and a low score of 62. The experimental group, this is all before the experiment, on exam 1 scored a mean score of 84 with a high score of 96 and a low score of 58. After the experiment, having been exposed to the PowerPoint presentation or not exposed, On exam 2, the control group had a mean score of 84 with a high of 96 and 64 as a low score. The experimental group on exam 2 had a mean score of 83. What that tells me, if we were to put it on a bar graph, is that there's no statistically significant difference between the control group and the experimental group with regards to content retention. In other words, they both did basically the same. There was no difference having been exposed to the independent variable, the PowerPoint presentation, or not being exposed to the PowerPoint presentation. The next thing we did was check the results on attendance. Attendance prior to the experiment, the control group had 86%, the experimental group had 85%. That is prior to exam 1. The attendance after the experiment indicated that the control group was at 84% and the experimental group was at 82%. Once again, we found that there was no statistical significant difference between the two groups. I might add, though, that we have what we call a confounding variable. The confounding variable is something that may affect the results that really has nothing to do with the actual experiment and the independent variable that we were engaged in. The confounding variable in this case was my pretty strict attendance policy. I let them know that if they miss more than so many classes per semester, they're dropped or they're encouraged to drop, okay? So it's possible that the attendance was not significantly affected because of my policy as opposed to the independent variable being the PowerPoint presentation. The next thing we found were the results with regards to note-taking. Again, here we did find a significant difference. Note-taking before the experiment by both the control group and the experimental group was at an average of 18 pages. Notes taken by the control group between exam 1 and exam 2 was 17 pages, which is pretty much similar to the way they were taking notes prior to the experiment. However, in this case, the experimental group had less note-taking taking place during the experimental phase. What that seemed to indicate to me is that, yes, the experimental group that had access to the PowerPoint presentation before, during, and after the experiment was perhaps getting a little bit lazy on the note-taking aspect. And so perhaps that needs to be looked at a little bit closer. However, I must admit that with the limited amount of data, and we just had 2 classes, I don't know if we have a sufficient sample size to be able to draw true conclusions with regards to the note-taking, okay? Again, you can see that here there is a significant difference between those that were taken before the experiment and those notes that were taken after the experiment. Clearly, it shows that about half of the notes that were taken before were now missing. In summary, there's really no statistical significant difference with regards to 2 of the issues that I was looking at. The content retention and the attendance, although we may have a confounding variable on the attendance. There was a statistical significant difference with regards to note-taking, and I think that's worth looking into and worth being the subject of future experimentation. Okay, it's recommended then that more statistics be gathered in this regard, and that we actually find out if in fact the less note taken was as a result of the fact that they had access to the PowerPoint presentation before and during and after the experiment. In conclusion, I'd like to state that previous studies had only examined those issues with regards to PowerPoint aesthetics, content, and presentation. My study was attempting to look at the behavioral aspects of having access to the PowerPoint presentation throughout the entire semester, which now the El Paso Community College can do through Blackboard. And what I found is that with regards to content retention and attendance, there's no real significant difference. With regards to the note-taking, there is a significant difference, and that needs to be looked into further. Thank you very much.